The moment is frozen in my memory with perfect clarity. The auditorium erupted in applause and gasps of amazement. People turned to look toward my family's section, pointing and whispering. Cameras flashed as media representatives realized they were witnessing something significant. But all I could focus on was the look of absolute shock on my parents' faces. My mother's mouth fell open. My father's face went completely pale. Jessica stopped texting and stared at the stage in complete bewilderment. And then, in a moment that summarized our entire family dynamic perfectly, my father's program slipped from his hands and fluttered to the floor, followed immediately by my mother's. They sat there in stunned silence, while 800 people celebrated an achievement they had never imagined possible. The daughter they had dismissed, minimized, and told to take the bus had quietly built a billion-dollar empire, while they were focused on buying luxury cars for their other child. As I walked across that stage to receive my diploma and special recognition, I felt something I had never experienced before in relation to my family: complete and total vindication. Every dismissal, every minimization, every moment of being treated as less deserving had led to this moment of undeniable proof that their assessment of my worth had been catastrophically wrong. The irony was delicious and devastating. While they had been investing tens of thousands of dollars in Jessica's cars and college preparation, I had been building something worth over $1 billion. While they had been dismissing my potential, I had been proving it on an international stage. While they had been treating me as an afterthought, I had been becoming the most successful person in our family's history. But perhaps the most satisfying part was realizing that their neglect had been a gift. Their lack of attention had given me the freedom to build without interference. Their dismissal had motivated me to prove them wrong on the biggest possible stage. Their decision to make me invisible had allowed me to work in complete secrecy until the moment of maximum impact. As I stood on that stage, holding my diploma and looking out at an audience that now understood exactly who Rebecca Thompson was, I realized that the bus ride to graduation had been perfect preparation for the journey ahead, because I had learned to get where I needed to go, entirely on my own terms. The reception after graduation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Media representatives surrounded me, asking about Thompson Tech Solutions and my plans for expansion. Industry leaders who had flown in specifically for the announcement were requesting meetings. University donors wanted to discuss endowment opportunities. And through it all, I could see my family hovering at the edges of the crowd, looking completely lost. My parents kept trying to catch my eye, clearly desperate to talk to me, but I was genuinely busy fielding questions from Forbes reporters and venture capital partners who had been tracking my company's growth. For the first time in my life, I was the center of attention at a family event, not because they had finally recognized my worth, but because the outside world had forced them to confront a reality they had completely missed. When I finally had a moment between interviews, my father approached with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been respect. "Rebecca, we had no idea. Why didn't you tell us about your company?" The question was so loaded with irony that I almost laughed. Why didn't I tell them? Because they had never shown interest in anything I was doing. Because every time I had tried to share my goals or dreams, They had been dismissed or overshadowed by Jessica's needs. Because I had learned that the safest way to pursue my ambitions was in complete silence. I was busy building it, I replied simply. You were busy with other priorities. My mother joined the conversation, her voice shaky, with what sounded like forced enthusiasm. We're so proud of you, honey. We always knew you were capable of great things. That statement hit me like a physical blow. They had always known I was capable of great things. Then why had they spent 24 years treating me like my achievements didn't matter? Why had they consistently invested in Jessica's potential while dismissing mine? Why had they told me to take the bus to my own graduation just 3 weeks earlier? Did you? I asked quietly. Because your actions suggested otherwise. Jessica finally approached, looking smaller and more uncertain than I had ever seen her. The sister who had spent years being the golden child, the center of attention, the recipient of every advantage, suddenly seemed to understand that the family dynamics had shifted permanently. Rebecca, I had no idea you were doing all this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you ever tell me? I looked at my younger sister, really looked at her, and felt a complex mix of emotions I wasn't prepared for. Anger, yes, but also something like pity. She had been as trapped in our family's dysfunction as I had been, just from the opposite side. While I had learned to be self-reliant and driven by their neglect, she had learned to be dependent and entitled by their overindulgence. Neither of us had received healthy parenting. Because we were never really close enough for those kinds of conversations, I answered honestly. Our family didn't work that way. The truth hung in the air between us. We weren't close. We had never been close. How could we be when our entire relationship had been defined by competition and comparison? When every interaction had been filtered through the lens of who was getting more attention, more resources, more love. Over the next hour, I watched my family struggle to process this new reality. They kept hovering nearby, clearly wanting to be included in the media attention and industry conversations happening around me, but having no idea how to insert themselves into a world they had never bothered to understand. My father kept introducing himself to reporters as Rebecca's father, as if that connection might grant him some reflected glory. My mother kept trying to position herself in photos, suddenly eager to be associated with my success. Jessica seemed genuinely overwhelmed, repeatedly saying, "I can't believe my sister is a billionaire," to anyone who would listen. But their attempts to claim proximity to my achievement felt hollow and desperate. They were like strangers trying to crash a party they had never been invited to, attempting to forge connections to a person they had never really bothered to know. The most telling moment came when a reporter asked my father about how the family had supported my entrepreneurial journey. He stammered through some generic response about always encouraging Rebecca's independence, while I stood there remembering every time that independence had been forced upon me through neglect and dismissal. When another journalist asked my mother about her proudest moment watching me build the company, she fumbled completely, clearly having no idea what milestones or challenges I had faced over the past 4 years. Because she had never asked, because they had never been interested enough to pay attention to the details of my life. As the afternoon wound down and the crowd began to disperse, my family clearly expected some kind of reconciliation moment. They lingered near my car, the modest used Honda I had been driving for 3 years, looking uncertain and hopeful. "Rebecca," my father said, "maybe we could all go to dinner to celebrate. There's obviously a lot we need to talk about." I looked at them standing there, and for the first time in my life, I held all the power in our relationship. They needed me now in ways they never had before. They wanted to be associated with my success, to claim some part of my achievement, to rebuild a relationship they had never prioritized when I needed them. But I also realized something profound in that moment. I didn't need their validation anymore. I had spent 24 years craving their approval, their recognition, their love. I had built an empire partly to prove my worth to people who had consistently undervalued me, and now standing in the parking lot of my graduate school with a billion-dollar company and international recognition, I understood that their opinion of me was irrelevant to my actual worth. "I don't think so," I said calmly. "I have investor meetings scheduled for this evening, and frankly, I'm not sure what we would talk about. You've made it clear over the years that my life and achievements aren't really your priority." My mother looked stricken. "That's not true, Rebecca. We love you. We've always loved you." "Maybe," I replied, "but love without interest, without investment, without priority, isn't really love at all. It's just a word people use to avoid feeling guilty about their choices." The next few weeks brought a whirlwind of media attention that completely transformed my public profile. Thompson Tech Solutions was featured on the cover of 3 major business magazines. I was invited to speak at international conferences about sustainable technology and entrepreneurship. Universities wanted me to give commencement addresses. The company's valuation continued to climb as investors recognized the long-term potential of our work in emerging markets. But perhaps more significantly, my story resonated with thousands of people who had experienced similar family dynamics. I received hundreds of emails from adults who had been scapegoated by their families, overlooked for golden child siblings, or dismissed by parents who failed to recognize their potential. The response was overwhelming and eye-opening. I hadn't realized how common these family patterns were, or how many people were carrying similar wounds from childhood experiences of favoritism and neglect. My public vindication became a symbol for everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough, smart enough, or deserving enough of their family's investment and attention. My family, meanwhile, was struggling to adapt to their new reality. The local media had picked up the story, and suddenly everyone in our community knew that the daughter they had consistently undervalued was now one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. Neighbors, friends, and extended family members were asking questions about how they had supported my journey. Questions they couldn't answer honestly. 3 weeks after graduation, my mother called me for the first time in months. Her voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the underlying desperation. "Rebecca, I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I realize we may have made some mistakes over the years. I'd love to have coffee and talk about how we can move forward as a family." The word mistakes was such a profound understatement that I almost ended the call immediately. 24 years of consistent favoritism, emotional neglect, and systematic dismissal were not mistakes. They were choices. They were patterns. They were a fundamental failure to see and value one of their own children. What exactly do you want to talk about? I asked. Well, I think there may have been some misunderstandings about how we showed support for you and Jessica differently. Maybe we could clear those up and find a way to be closer going forward. Misunderstandings? As if the problem was my perception rather than their actions. As if years of documented favoritism could be explained away as simple communication issues. Mom, there weren't any misunderstandings. You and Dad made conscious choices about how to allocate your time, money, and attention. Jessica received the vast majority of both emotional and financial support, while I learned to provide those things for myself. Those weren't accidents or misunderstandings. They were your priorities. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with my mother alternating between attempts to minimize the past, we did the best we could, and promises about the future. Things can be different now. But I noticed something crucial. At no point did she take genuine responsibility for the impact of their choices on my development and our relationship. There was no acknowledgement of the pain their favoritism had caused, no recognition of how their dismissal had affected my self-worth, no understanding of what it had been like to grow up feeling invisible in my own family. Instead, there were excuses, justifications, and attempts to reframe their neglect as character-building independence training. Similar conversations happened with my father and Jessica over the following weeks. My father focused primarily on the business aspects, suddenly very interested in my company's operations and growth strategies. He kept suggesting ways he could help with marketing or business development, clearly hoping to insert himself into my professional success. Jessica's approach was different but equally revealing. She seemed genuinely confused about why I was holding grudges about childhood experiences. From her perspective, she had simply received love and support from our parents. Why should that be a source of conflict between us? She couldn't understand that the issue wasn't her receiving advantages, but rather the systematic way I had been excluded from receiving similar support. The most challenging conversation came when all three of them approached me together about 6 weeks after graduation. They had clearly planned this intervention, probably hoping that presenting a united front would be more persuasive than individual appeals. "Rebecca," my father began, "we've been talking as a family, and we want you to know that we're ready to make changes. We realize we may not have always been perfectly fair in how we handled things, and we want to do better going forward." "What does doing better look like to you?" I asked. "Well, we could spend more time together," my mother offered. "Maybe family dinners once a week, and we could take more interest in your business." "We could travel together," Jessica added enthusiastically. "Maybe take a family vacation to celebrate your success." I looked at the three of them sitting across from me in the coffee shop they had chosen for this conversation, and I felt a profound sadness. They were offering me scraps of attention and affection now that my success had made me valuable to them. They wanted to be associated with my achievement, to benefit from my resources, to claim credit for my resilience. But none of them seemed to understand that true repair would require genuine accountability. It would require acknowledging the specific ways their choices had harmed me. It would require understanding the long-term impact of favoritism on both Jessica and me. It would require demonstrating changed behavior over time, not just making promises about future improvements. I appreciate that you want things to be different, I said carefully, but I don't think you understand what that would actually require. You're asking me to pretend the past didn't happen and trust that the future will be better, but you haven't actually acknowledged what went wrong or taken responsibility for how your choices affected me. We're acknowledging it now, my father said impatiently. We're here, aren't we? We're trying to fix things. You're here because my success has made me valuable to you in ways I never was before. But you're not here because you've developed genuine insight into how your parenting affected me, or because you've done the work to understand your own behavior patterns. The conversation deteriorated from there. My father became defensive, insisting that they had always done their best, and that I was being unnecessarily harsh about normal family dynamics. My mother cried and accused me of punishing the whole family for perceived slights from childhood. Jessica looked increasingly uncomfortable as she began to understand that the family dynamics she had benefited from had come at my expense. I realized in that moment that they weren't actually interested in repair. They were interested in reconciliation without responsibility. They wanted the relationship benefits without doing the difficult work of understanding and changing their patterns. They wanted me to forgive and forget without them having to truly acknowledge and address the harm they had caused. That's when I made the decision that would define the next chapter of my life. I chose to establish complete boundaries with my family of origin and focus on building the chosen family and authentic relationships I deserved. The decision to go no contact wasn't made in anger or as punishment, though I'm sure that's how my family interpreted it. It was made from a place of clarity and self-protection. I had spent 24 years trying to earn love and recognition from people who were fundamentally unable or unwilling to provide it. I had built a billion-dollar company partly to prove my worth to people whose opinion of me was based on dysfunction rather than reality. But now I had proof of my worth that was independent of their recognition. I had achieved success that couldn't be minimized or dismissed. I had built something meaningful that was entirely my own, and I realized that continuing to engage with people who had consistently devalued me was actually holding me back from the full life I deserved. The practical aspects of going no contact were surprisingly straightforward. I changed my phone number and gave the new one only to people who had demonstrated genuine care for my well-being. I moved to a different city where Thompson Tech Solutions was opening a new headquarters. I removed my family from all social media connections and blocked their attempts to contact me through those channels. More importantly, I began the emotional work of healing from 24 years of family dysfunction. I started working with a therapist who specialized in family trauma and scapegoat recovery. I learned about narcissistic family systems, golden child scapegoat dynamics, and the long-term effects of emotional neglect. The therapy process was challenging but revelatory. I began to understand that my perfectionism wasn't just about achieving success. It was a trauma response, developed from years of trying to earn love through achievement. My people-pleasing tendencies weren't kindness. They were survival mechanisms, learned from a childhood where my needs were consistently dismissed. I also learned that my family's dysfunction wasn't my fault or my responsibility to fix. I had spent years trying to be good enough, successful enough, accomplished enough to earn their love and attention. But the problem had never been my worthiness. It had been their inability to see and value what was right in front of them. As I worked through these realizations, I began to experience something I had never felt before: genuine peace. Without the constant stress of trying to manage my family's reactions or earn their approval, I had energy to focus on building the life I actually wanted, rather than the life I thought might finally make them proud. I threw myself into expanding Thompson Tech Solutions with renewed passion and clarity. We launched initiatives in 8 new countries, developed revolutionary water purification technology that could serve entire communities, and created educational programs that were reaching millions of children in underserved areas. But more than professional success, I began building the authentic relationships I had always craved. I developed genuine friendships with colleagues who shared my values and interests. I found mentors who invested in my growth without expecting anything in return. I created chosen family relationships with people who saw and appreciated who I really was, not who they needed me to be. The contrast was stark and healing. Where my family of origin had been competitive and conditional, my chosen family was collaborative and accepting. Where my biological relationships had been based on roles and expectations, my new relationships were based on mutual respect and genuine affection. I also began using my resources and platform to help other people who had experienced similar family dynamics. I established a foundation focused on supporting young entrepreneurs from dysfunctional family backgrounds, providing both financial resources and emotional support for people trying to build successful lives despite childhood trauma. The foundation's work became deeply personal and meaningful to me. I received thousands of applications from young adults who had been dismissed, overlooked, or actively undermined by their families. Their stories echoed my own experiences of being told they weren't smart enough, talented enough, or worthy enough of investment and support. We provided scholarships, mentorship programs, therapy resources, and business development support. But perhaps most importantly, we created a community where people could find validation for their experiences and support for their healing journeys. One of our scholarship recipients, Marcus, had been told by his family that college was a waste of money for someone like him. With our support, he earned a PhD in environmental engineering and now leads sustainable development projects across Southeast Asia. Another recipient, Sarah, had been dismissed by her family as not business-minded while they funded her brother's multiple failed startups. She used our mentorship program to build a successful social enterprise that provides job training for women in rural communities. These success stories weren't just professional victories, they were examples of people reclaiming their worth and potential after years of having it denied by the people who should have been their biggest supporters. They were proof that family dysfunction doesn't have to define or limit someone's life trajectory. 3 years after graduation, I received a wedding invitation that crystallized how much my life had changed. It was from my college roommate Emma, who had become one of my closest friends and biggest supporters. She was marrying James, a man she had met through our mutual friend network, the chosen family I had built over the past few years. As I stood in Emma's wedding as her maid of honor, surrounded by people who genuinely knew and loved me, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life I had created. This was what real family felt like. People who celebrated your successes without needing to diminish them, who supported your dreams without trying to control them, who loved you for who you were rather than who they needed you to be. During the reception, Emma's father gave a toast that brought tears to my eyes. He spoke about how proud he was to watch Emma build a life filled with people who saw and appreciated her authentic self. He talked about the joy of watching her surround herself with friends who had become family, and family who had become true friends. I thought about the contrast with my own family experience. Emma's parents had attended every milestone, celebrated every achievement, and supported every dream. They had created a foundation of love and security that allowed her to build healthy relationships and pursue her goals with confidence. But I also realized that my different path had led to its own kind of strength. I had learned to create my own foundation, to validate my own worth, to build success without external approval. I had developed resilience, independence, and clarity about what truly mattered to me. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. I had broken generational patterns of dysfunction, created genuine prosperity, and built authentic relationships. I had proven to myself most of all that family trauma doesn't have to be a life sentence. As I looked around the reception at the people who had become my chosen family, I felt something I had never experienced at family gatherings growing up: complete acceptance and belonging. These people knew my story, understood my journey, and loved me, not despite my struggles, but because of how I had transformed them into strength. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly free from the need to prove my worth to people who couldn't see it, free from the obligation to maintain relationships that diminished rather than nourished me, free to build the life I actually wanted rather than the one I thought might finally earn approval. My biological family occasionally attempted to reach out through mutual acquaintances or extended family members. They seemed to believe that enough time had passed for us to get past our issues and rebuild our relationship, but they continued to frame the problem as my unwillingness to forgive rather than their unwillingness to change. I learned to see these attempted reconciliations for what they really were, not genuine efforts at repair, but continued attempts to benefit from my success, without doing the work of understanding their role in our fractured relationships. They wanted the rewards of being associated with my achievements, without taking responsibility for the years they had dismissed and devalued those same capabilities. My response was consistent and clear. I was open to relationship with people who could take genuine responsibility for their actions and demonstrate sustained change over time. I was not interested in pretending the past hadn't happened or accepting superficial apologies that didn't address the real issues. This boundary was challenging to maintain, especially during holidays and major life events when societal pressure to reconcile with family was strongest. Well-meaning friends and acquaintances often suggested that I was being too harsh, that family was more important than past grievances, that I should give them another chance. But I had learned to trust my own judgment about what relationships served my well-being and which ones undermined it. I had experienced genuine love and support from my chosen family, and I refused to accept less from anyone else, biological relationship or not. The foundation continued to grow and impact thousands of lives. Thompson Tech Solutions expanded into 15 countries and achieved a valuation of over $2 billion. I was recognized as one of the top entrepreneurs under 30, invited to speak at major universities, and featured on the covers of international business magazines. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. I received letters from young adults who had read about my story and found courage to set boundaries with their own dysfunctional families. Parents reached out to share how my experience had helped them recognize and change favoritism patterns with their own children. Therapists contacted me about using my story as an example of successful recovery from family trauma. My journey had become bigger than just personal success. It had become a blueprint for other people trying to heal from similar wounds and build authentic lives despite difficult beginnings. 5 years after that graduation day, when my parents dropped their programs in shock, I stood on another stage receiving another award, this time for philanthropic leadership and social impact. As I looked out at the audience, I saw the faces of foundation scholarship recipients, chosen family members, business partners, and community leaders who had supported my mission to help others overcome systemic disadvantages. I thought about the Rebecca who had taken the bus to graduation, believing she wasn't worthy of her family's support or investment. I thought about the years of self-doubt, people-pleasing, and desperate attempts to earn love through achievement. And I realized that the greatest success wasn't the billion-dollar company or the international recognition. It was the journey of learning to value myself independent of external validation. It was the courage to walk away from relationships that diminished me and build ones that celebrated who I really was. The little girl who had eaten birthday pizza alone in her room had grown up to create communities where no one had to celebrate their victories in isolation. The teenager who had been told to figure out transportation yourself had built global infrastructure systems that connected millions of people to opportunities and resources. Most importantly, the young woman who had been dismissed and devalued by the people who should have loved her most had learned to create the love, recognition, and support she deserved, and then share that same gift with thousands of others who needed it just as desperately as she once had. Standing on that stage, I felt the completeness of my transformation. I was no longer the scapegoat child trying to earn approval. I was no longer the invisible daughter hoping to be seen. I was Rebecca Thompson, entrepreneur, philanthropist, and living proof that our worth is never determined by other people's ability to recognize it. The bus ride to graduation had been the beginning of the most important journey of my life, the journey toward authentic self-worth and genuine belonging. And I had arrived exactly where I was meant to be.